Hi, I'm Kevin Chapman, and I'm a licensed psychologist, and I am a board member for the Andrew Kukes Foundation for Social Anxiety, and I'm quite sure this is our first Periscope to talk about cognitive behavioral therapy and how that's related to social anxiety. And I guess I'll first start by saying that CBT, or cognitive behavior therapy, is definitely considered the gold standard treatment approach for social anxiety. And CBT is a very refined approach. There's a number of different myths about CBT, and there's a number of facts about CBT. And I thought the first scope that we would do on behalf of the Andrew Kukes Foundation for Social Anxiety would be to kind of talk about some of that, to give you a preview, if you will, or some snippets about what one might expect in treatment, and then talk about not only that, but some common myths related to CBT. So I could first start by saying that one myth, I guess if we were playing Family Feud and we're to say, the top 5 answers are on the board, the number one myth, I think, related to cognitive behavioral treatment as it relates to all types of anxiety, but specifically social anxiety, would be that CBT is about changing negative thoughts to positive thoughts. Negative thoughts to positive thoughts. Well, we all know the benefit of thinking about things more optimistically and in a positive light. But that's not entirely true for CBT. CBT is not really in the business of teaching one to think positively per se. It's more about teaching people how to think from an evidence-based standpoint. So in other words, many thought processes that we have that lead to strong negative emotions tend to reflect ways of thinking that are inaccurate as it relates to the evidence. So in other words, like if I had a bad day, I was in a car accident and a tree fell on my hood, or someone gave me some negative feedback at work and I failed a test. Well, for me to say, oh, this was an awesome day, everything's sunshine and roses, is obviously not true, right? So in other words, it's not necessarily changing negative thoughts to positive thoughts. It's really more about, well, what's the evidence say about the anxiety that I'm having? Or what's the evidence say about this way of thinking, right? So CBT is more about analyzing anxiety-provoking thoughts and looking at the accuracy. So in other words, it's a scientific way to say, I'm going to treat my thoughts like hypotheses rather than facts and test those beliefs out. So one myth that we need to dispel immediately is that CBT is about changing negative thoughts to positive thoughts. That's simply not true, although positive thoughts are part of that. Okay, I guess another myth that I'll dispel immediately will be that, well, if I'm afraid of something, that CBT will just put me in a situation where I'm afraid of heights, or I'm afraid of social interaction or public speaking, and therefore someone who does CBT will essentially make me do that right away. Well, that's a technique that is effective for some people. We call it flooding, but CBT doesn't necessarily do that either. So in other words, exposure therapy, which is a component of CBT, tends to be conducted in what we call a graduated fashion. So in other words, if I have social anxiety, then I'm not going to say, well, if public speaking is the most distressing thing that is on your fear hierarchy, well, tomorrow what I'll teach you is, let's just go grab 50 people and we'll get a podium and a microphone. We'll read the Gettysburg Address or something to that effect, and we'll just say, just give the speech and you'll get over your fear. How many people would sign up for that, right? Not very many. You'd hear crickets, right? No one would sign up for that. So essentially that's not true. CBT is conducted in a graduated way. So we tend to call that systematic graduated exposure. So in other words, we would create a hierarchy in the case of social anxiety. And in the case of social anxiety, what we would do is we would essentially say, okay, let's rank order situations that are anxiety provoking. And from there, what we'll do is we will gradually expose you to those situations, but not before you learn cognitive skills. One of the mottos that I like to use with my clients when I'm working with social anxiety is, you don't send a soldier out to battle without basic training. Think about that. So in other words, putting someone in an anxiety-provoking situation right away is essentially what most clients would tell you they've done. Well, I've tried to get over my fear. I've tried to get over public speaking. I've tried to get over initiating a conversation with people. That's not the issue. The issue becomes, how do I do that in a way that teaches me to think about my anxiety in a different, more flexible way, and then confront not only the feelings, but also the situation itself. And you do that in a very graduated way. So that's another myth. CBT people who do actual CBT, so people who actually engage in actual CBT within the confines of a research program, for example, they're definitely not going to flood you. They're going to do it in what we call a systematic, graduated fashion. Okay, so that's another myth. So with that being said, I think that's probably a good place for me to say, well, if I had to give you the ingredients of CBT for social anxiety, most people who engage in CBT, us practitioners, we would say that CBT tends to have 3 potent treatment ingredients. Okay? 3 really good treatment ingredients. So, and these are not in any particular order. The first ingredient of CBT would be what we call systematic graduated exposure, right? So systematic graduated exposure, yet again, is the process of creating an exposure hierarchy and then gradually confronting social anxiety provoking situations. So case in point, let's say that I really struggle with giving presentations in a meeting. Well, on a scale from 0 to 100, 100 meaning, oh, get me out of there immediately, 0 meaning, oh, I'm at the beach, no problem whatsoever, then many people who have a fear of public speaking would say, well, that's a 100 for me, right? So that's the last thing we would do. So we would create a hierarchy collaboratively, and on that hierarchy, that might be the highest item, but we would begin somewhere on the hierarchy with a situation that is moderately distressing, like 45 or 50, right? So it's uncomfortable to me, Kevin, but it's something that with help I could do. So we would start with something, say, for example, something that's quite common would be to interact with someone that I'm loosely familiar with for 5 minutes, right? So small talk. So that might be where we would begin. And then we would gradually work our way up to bigger groups and so on and so forth. So with that being said, we would continue to confront while teaching some of the other skills that I'll tell you about in a second. So one ingredient that will absolutely be the case when you're dealing with social anxiety, which, by the way, we all have social anxiety. The issue is not whether or not you have it. The issue is where it is on a continuum. So in other words, the actual diagnosis of social anxiety would be on a continuum of social anxiety that we all experience. Why? Because any social situation that we're in, we have the possibility of being scrutinized, right? You could go to a gas station and that could be the case. So the issue is, yes, we all have social anxiety, but on a continuum, social anxiety disorder becomes debilitating and it impairs functioning. So with that being said, systematic graduated exposure is going to be an absolutely necessary ingredient for any CBT that takes place for social anxiety. The second ingredient of treatment for social anxiety with CBT would be cognitive restructuring. And cognitive restructuring is basically, and the simplest way to put it would be to teach you to analyze anxiety-provoking cognitions and teach you how to manage that anxiety and regulate it in a way so that social situations are less distressing. So you literally would treat thoughts as hypotheses rather than facts. I'll say that again. So you teach people to treat thoughts like hypotheses rather than facts. Well, if you know anything about the scientific method, what we're going to do, obviously, is we're going to treat our thoughts by testing those out. Let's see and determine whether or not these are valid. So, for example, let me give you an example. So, let's say I'm prone to scrutiny and I get really anxious about ambiguous email, right? So, say you have a supervisor and the supervisor says something to the effect in an email like, you know, hey, Kevin, I want to see you in my office at 2 o'clock. Well, if I'm prone to social anxiety, one thought I could have would be, clearly he's upset with my work. So, of course, the physiological part of that is I'm going to have heart palpitations, I'm going to have shortness of breath, I'm going to get hot, so on and so forth. Well, CBT would teach you to say, wait a second, what's the evidence that he's upset with your work? Well, he sent me an email. Okay. Well, what's another perspective? Does the email have to mean that he's upset with your work? Well, no, but it's likely. Okay, well, what's another perspective? Could he have sent the email for another reason? Well, possibly. Well, what's another scenario for that? Well, it could be that he wants you to take over during vacation. Okay. It could be that he wants to give you a raise. We'd love that. It could be, well, so-and-so seems to be struggling. Can you check in with them? Well, let's test out and see what happens. So what happens at 2 o'clock? Well, the likelihood that you're going to be scrutinized is low. So therefore, what happens is you've gained new knowledge and new evidence to suggest that that thought that you had is actually not a fact. It was a hypothesis that was inaccurate. So if you're a scientist, what are you going to do? You're going to formulate a different hypothesis. So in the case of CBT, you're going to have what I call a rational response, and you're going to utilize a different way to think about that situation. So the second ingredient of CBT, again, is what we call cognitive restructuring. And the third ingredient of any CBT as it relates to treating social anxiety, this is a drum roll, and I'm being sarcastic, it's homework. So homework is actually an active ingredient for CBT. Why? Because if you look at most research, it would suggest that if you see a client once a week for an hour to manage their social anxiety, then you spend roughly 1% or so of your waking hours with that clinician. Meaning 99% of whoever you're seeing is going to be elsewhere. So CBT has what we call high external validity, right? So in other words, what we do in the office will generalize outside of the office. And I do want to add that CBT doesn't necessarily just take place in an office setting. If you're engaging in a CBT plan for social anxiety, it is extremely common, actually more of the rule, not the exception, to engage in exposure exercises outside of the office, which could entail going to a store, being a fly on the wall while a client interacts with someone and you're supervising it, so to speak, or watching and observing someone order coffee at Starbucks. Like, these are all common experiences that people who engage in CBT will have, so that the things you learn in therapy will generalize to the real world. So with that being said, 3 components: systematic graduated exposure, cognitive restructuring, and then homework. Okay, so one thing to look for if you're trying to find a practitioner who engages in CBT, which is another myth, is that anybody can do CBT. Well, the problem with that is that many people confuse the conceptual and the research generated from CBT with just CBT techniques. And that's unfortunate, because although CBT tools are effective, someone who really is engaging in a treatment program of CBT should look for the following. They should look for a practitioner who has extensive training in CBT, as evidenced by seeing their CV or resume, looking at some of the talks they've been to, some of the talks they've actually presented in, the conferences that they normally go to, say their training program would be important. And I would also say that something that is really subtle but important is to look for the time-limited nature of their treatment program. If you look at many CBT protocols, many practitioners will tell you that, often CBT for social anxiety can roughly be approximately 16 or so sessions. That would suggest that someone has a very structured approach that's collaborative, and it's extremely homework driven and empirically supported. So look for someone who, of course, in their CV, their website, speaks to presenting about CBT, that they've written or published manuscripts or book chapters on CBT, and make sure that they have a time-limited approach, because that's one of the hallmark features of CBT. And I just want to thank you guys for tuning in to the Periscope. This won't be the last one, so I thought this would be a good introduction. And again, I'm Kevin Chapman, licensed psychologist, board member for the Andrew Kukes Foundation for Social Anxiety. And if you guys have questions, feel free to follow up. You can follow AKFSA on Twitter, on Facebook. You can also find me on Twitter as well, at Dr. KChap. So if you guys have questions, feel free to follow up, and I'll see you on the next scope. Bye-bye.